group of us. So sorry if this is sort of may feel like a bit of a lecture without that many people to interact. But feel free to sort of interject at any point and ask questions if what I'm sort of getting into doesn't feel relevant and there's other stuff that you'd like to ask about. I'll do my best to answer it. So I'll just try and get my slides up one moment. Can everybody see that?
Yeah, can see it.
Great. And I just wanted to check, because I have given this presentation to some junior doctors before. This isn't, you haven't, any of you done this before, and I'm going to be boring you with it. I'll take that as a no.
Yeah, no, I haven't had it before.
Cool. So this is just a sort of general overview of what quality improvement is all about, the key methodology, the general concepts. I think there was a request for a little bit more detail and sort of some examples. So what I've done through this sort of session is added in a bunch of examples from work that actually is going on at ESHT or that I've been involved with, and some of the slightly more advanced concepts from our higher levels of training. But it probably will still only run to about an hour, or maybe just after the hour now that we've sort of lost 10 minutes. So just to start with a general definition of what quality improvement is all about. So in QI, we're talking about continuous unceasing efforts to make changes that will lead to better outcomes, system performance, and understanding where we are and systematically applying ideas to make our care better. So the sort of key take-home things that I think it's important for people to focus on is that QI isn't a method to use for one-off initiatives or project managing the delivery of one particular thing. It's about identifying an area where you can potentially improve and continuously working to get the best possible outcome. So it continues over time with various different things being tried out to improve it. And it's systematic in the sense that we're applying a framework that is evidence-based to how we make those improvements. There isn't one sort of gold standard definition of quality improvement. There's quite a lot of different ways of framing it, and this is just the one that we tend to use. But I'll give some examples. The types of things that we sometimes work on in improvement project. I think people are often tend to think of QI as being mainly around patient safety. I'm going to talk a lot about falls reduction work, which I work on personally, and previously members of our team have been involved with things like pressure ulcers and bed sores, sepsis. So those kind of things are sort of the traditional clinical improvements that people tend to associate with QI, but actually it's a lot broader than that, and it can apply to anything that might potentially be an improvement. So one of the things I like to emphasize is that a lot of improvement initiatives don't necessarily focus on anything very clinical or technical. They just focus on generally improving how an area of the hospital or the organisation runs. So it could be around just labelling things better, organising an area in a more intuitive way. So a lot of stuff like that can actually make big improvements to how a team operates. We also do a lot of work looking at systems and processes. So, in big organisations like NHS trusts, over time we can develop ways of doing things that are sort of convoluted or out of date, or there are inefficiencies. And so we support teams to kind of step back and look at what they're doing and say, is this still sort of fit for purpose? Are there ways of doing this that could be better? Can we cut out some of the steps that aren't adding any value? So there's a lot of QI projects that do that kind of improving efficiency kind of work. We also look at standardizing things. So particularly at Esht, we've got 2 different hospitals that are quite separate geographically, and there are often big differences between the way teams at different sides of the county are doing things. So we need to ask, is there one way which is the best way of doing that, and ensure that all teams are taking that best practice approach. Also, it's not necessarily about just important performance improvement in terms of traditional healthcare outcomes. We also sometimes want to think about things that improve how a team is performing, how people feel engaged with their work, because there's a lot of evidence that those kind of things can have a knock-on impact on patient outcomes. So yeah, I mean, there's a whole range of ways that you can look at quality improvement, but in general, we're looking for anything that's going to ultimately have a benefit to the organisation that will benefit the patients. So we really want to encourage people to get involved in quality improvement, and the process that you guys would go through in your training of sort of doing a clinical audit can be a great first step in identifying a problem that could then become a QI project. However, there are sort of methods that we want to encourage people to use. So we try and ask anyone who's interested in QI to kind of engage with us first and not dive straight into it, because otherwise you might take an approach that's not going to result in the sort of outcomes you might be hoping for. So what I'm going to talk about now is the approach or the model that we use for quality improvement here at Esht. So this is called the Model for Improvement. It's a framework for delivering QI initiatives that's used in a lot of NHS organisations. There's quite a bit of evidence that it works, or that it tends to result in improvements. And what this is about is answering 3 key questions, and that is clearly defining what it is that we're trying to accomplish. So sometimes when somebody initially identifies a problem, their understanding of it isn't clear enough to really set out what we want to improve. Sometimes what we think is a problem isn't the problem. So we spend a lot of time initially figuring out what the real root cause of the issue is, and what it is that we're trying to improve. And in order to do that, then we have to have the next step, which is around measurement, which is around what is it that we could, what measurements can we take that will show us that we've made an improvement. So we don't want to be delivering things in quality improvement that there's no way of proving it, that it had an impact, that we just did something differently, or we implemented a project and then we would just tick it off as having been achieved because we've delivered it. We need to measure an outcome for the patients that demonstrates that it was worth doing. And then the sort of key difference between quality improvement and other methods of project management or managing change is that we're not starting with a solution in mind. So QI is not a method for delivering something that you've already decided you want to do. It's a method for testing out various different potential changes that could improve the problem that you've identified. And how we do that is through what's called the PDSA process. So we've got a list of ideas of things that might potentially solve our problem, and we test them all out on a smaller scale as possible to get some data back about what seems to work and what doesn't. So I'll go into a bit more detail about all of these sort of key concepts with some examples. So how this differs from what we might traditionally have done in healthcare when we're delivering changes is quite often we would have a pilot study or some kind of initiative, and what you would often see is that maybe we choose an area or a team in the hospital, but it's sort of a scattergun approach where we try to do everything that might help at the same time. We invest quite a lot of resource in it to start with, and there's this big.
Sorry to interrupt. I
Go
don't know
ahead.
if the slides are following. Are you going through the slides that are stuck on the first one still?
Have you only seen one slide so far?
Yeah, no, only the first one.
Oh, that's really frustrating. Has it gone
Sorry.
back to PowerPoint?
Yeah, now it's on slide 6.
I'm not sure why that is. Because on my screen it was showing them.
Maybe if you go into the full PowerPoint, so do the full slideshow.
So,
Try.
so is that open on the pilot study slide now?
Yeah, the change through is still small steps, but it's still not actually in the proper PowerPoint as a slideshow.
Do you mean upload it in Teams?
Yeah, so I can see you got PowerPoint open, but it's not actually within the slideshow.
Oh, I see. Oh, right. That's, oh God. I hate when this happens. I'm trying to remember the solution. I think I'm going to have to upload it into Teams because I'm not sure why it's doing that. So you just had it, so you never saw the slideshow?
No, I thought it was just stuck on the first one, sorry. And I thought you were just talking around it from the first one.
Adam, would you like to send it to me and I can upload it from here? Oh, there you go.
See it.
There you go. Yes.
Right. So I'll quickly go back through the slide. I don't think there was anything super pertinent on them, although it must have sounded a bit weird because I was just talking endlessly without the slides. Has that changed slides now so everyone can see the definitions now?
Yeah.
Yes. Yes.
So
definitely.
that was what I was talking about through the definitions. You would have heard that. Here are some lovely animations that you didn't get to see about what can be improved. And a sloth. And so, yeah, model for improvements. I think it's quite helpful to see that diagram. So I think, yeah, so this is where I got to about the idea that, yeah, often when we've got something that we want to change, we launch it into a pilot study or an initiative where we try and do everything at once, and it doesn't give us a lot of helpful data. And the real issue is that it's not very, it doesn't tend to be successful in embedding sustained change. A lot of these things are not successful in achieving the outcomes that are wanted straight away, and so they get sort of binned, and then the same issue will come around a few years later, and people say, "Oh, didn't we try to fix this a couple of years ago?" And so you get into this cycle, and that's why I emphasise the idea of QI initiatives being continuous, because it's not a question of things working or not working. You gather this from everything that doesn't work and move on to the next potential solution. I don't know if that's sort of something that people have had experience of initiatives that that were perhaps ill-conceived, or big pushes behind a particular thing. I know you guys are relatively early in your career, but it does happen all the time in the NHS. Is that something that sort of sounds familiar to anyone? All right, well, there are only 3 of you, so there may not, or 4 of you or something, so there may not be that many examples out there, but it is an endemic problem in the NHS that that we launch resources into things in a kind of one-off way without taking a systematic approach. So just a bit more detail on this kind of clarifying our aims aspect. So again, often when we're looking at a problem, there's a desire to just fix it, to get it sorted out, and sometimes the goals can be unrealistic. We're trying to completely stop a particular type of error, for example, or we're expecting it to be solved within a few months when really it needs a long, continuous period in order to be resolved. Or it could be, too vague. We're just saying that this service in general needs to get better, or we need to make our patients, healthier and prevent problems. But what we would start doing in a quality improvement initiative is to really try and clarify what is the specific problem we're trying to fix, and what would be a realistic level of performance to improve, maybe looking at benchmarks from other trusts, and how long might we expect to be able to do that in. So here's an example of somebody that I worked with, so a lady called Marie Dixon, who works in pathology, and this was about haematology, so the taking of blood samples, and what she had identified in her work in pathology was that they were getting quite a lot of samples that they couldn't use, that there was something wrong with them. But before just launching into a general project of trying to improve or reduce the number of errors, which you might have done if we sort of launched straight into it without getting any further information, the interventions would have been quite bland and generic. There would have been, send out some communications telling people to keep an eye on this, or put some posters up, and that kind of broad brush approach isn't usually that helpful. We don't usually identify any improvements. So this was Marie's scoping work to sort of find out more about what the problem was. So the first thing that she did was to look at the data about where these errors were happening, and it became quite clear that the majority of them were coming from A&E, which is to be expected because of the characteristics of the patients coming in and the way that they're working and the level of pressure. So most of these errors are happening in A&E, so you've kind of whittled down the problem a bit more by gathering that information. And then what you can see on the right, that diagram is what's called a spaghetti diagram. So she actually went in person to A&E and sort of sat in the corner, and you draw on a page of paper where people are moving around, where they're going within that space, to try and identify where things are going wrong, where people are kind of moving it around inefficiently, and just get a first-hand view of what the problem might be in that particular area. And then the final thing, the chart on the left, this is what's called a Pareto analysis. So she's looked at the different types. So there's sort of about a dozen different error codes, things that can go wrong with a blood sample. But what you'll find with something like that, where you're recording different types of errors, different things that are going wrong, is that usually there's a few categories that are accounting for the great majority of the cases. And that was the case here. That I can't remember what these the error codes stand for now, but I think it was sort of samples. I think mislabeled samples accounted for a lot of them, and there were also ones that had coagulated before they reached the lab and stuff like that. So by doing all of this kind of scoping work, instead of just doing a general project to improve errors in blood samples, she's able to do a much more focused, targeted project to improve certain types of blood samples in a certain area, and maybe even learned a bit about where those errors are happening by sort of observing directly in the area of work. And this is an example here of some of the scoping work that I did when I started working on patient falls. Similarly, looked at different areas around the trust for where would be the best place to address first, and we found there's really high rate of falls in AMU at Eastbourne. Again, that's not an indication of necessarily a problem with quality of care. It's just about the volume of patients and the patient characteristics, but that was where the opportunity for improvement existed. And done a similar thing of sort of categorizing the different types of falls from the DATEX information that we had available. And what's quite interesting if you look at falls data in the trust is that, if you didn't have this data, you might assume that the falls is a sort of a health and safety issue where you're concerned about cluttered environments and people slipping and tripping over things. But actually, what we found was that it was primarily a problem with sort of communicating with patients and patients not necessarily being following advice to get support to go to the toilet and things like that. So that enabled us to have a much more focused approach on what we looked at in terms of reducing falls. So we're not just trying to address every risk factor in falls, which is very multifactorial and would be a really broad brush approach. We can look at the things that we know are causing the issue, which in this case in AMU at Eastbourne was around patients mobilising on their own to the toilet, and to a lesser extent not having actions taken on the risk assessments and stuff like that. So there's a couple of examples there, but there's quite a lot of different methods that you can use for scoping out the causes of a problem. So we often do forms of root cause analysis to talk to people about what is the cause behind the cause. If there's nobody there to watch the patient, why was that? Oh, maybe it was because there's this problem with staffing levels. Why is there an issue with staffing levels, and so on? And you get into conversations that sort of lead you to the real underlying cause of a problem. And as I mentioned, the work that you guys would be doing to perhaps carry out some audits and look at a particular problem would be a starting point potentially for an improvement project. And the image that you can see on your bottom right there with all the post-it notes, that's sort of an affinity diagram where you're just getting a bunch of people together to identify what they think the problems might be in their area and then sort of grouping them into categories. Process mapping, sort of similar principle, but a little bit more technical, where you're looking at the stages of a pathway of care as a person comes into an area or into a service, or it could also be used for information or administrative stuff, but we're usually looking at what the referral coming in and how we're supporting that patient and using that as a way of figuring out where things in that are going wrong along that process. And I'll give some examples of that in a minute. It can also be really helpful, it's essential really, to start having conversations with people before you deliver an improvement project about what understanding they have of the problem, and doing a bit of stakeholder engagement. And this is something that we're increasingly emphasising in quality improvement, that sometimes people can be in their comfort zone talking just about or looking just at the data and the technical elements of a particular problem, but often that won't help us if we can't persuade a lot of people to get on board with supporting that, because there may be many staff who are affected by a particular change that we're trying to deliver. So I've just included a little bit of content from our stakeholder engagement sort of training, although we do spend whole days on this, so there's a lot more that you could learn. But I think the one thing to sort of really get across is so everybody has sort of particular issues that they might be interested in, that they've identified as being problematic in the organisation, or perhaps you've got an academic interest in, but it can be easy to overlook the fact that other staff within the organisation aren't going to necessarily see it the same way. They've got dozens of competing priorities, and just going in and saying you know, there's lots of guidance saying that we should be doing this, and there's lots of evidence, isn't necessarily enough to persuade people to actually make a change. So we really need to think before trying to deliver a change or an improvement about how we can sort of sell it to people, really, because although, you know, obviously avoiding errors and improving the way that we deliver services is important, there are all sorts of different things and different ways of doing that, and we need to, if you've got something that you're passionate about, you have to persuade people to feel the same way about it. So yeah, framing that message in terms of the things that that person is concerned about, you know, particularly if it's a you know, it might well be a matron on a ward. Their real concern is about, you know, the efficient running of their area, not any one particular issue. So, you know, it would have to be framed in terms of, you know, how is this going to make life easier for you and your team, as opposed to, you know, a bunch of you know, scientific evidence that you might find really interesting. So as I sort of touched upon a minute ago, all quality improvement projects should have some kind of measurement element where we can show empirically that some kind of improvement has taken place. As I'll sort of get into in a minute, that can present some challenges, particularly with if the issue that you're concerned with doesn't happen that frequently. So you have to sometimes be a bit creative about how you implement that measurement. So the core thing that we'd be interested in is outcome measures, so something that represents an improvement for the patient. However, quite often, if patient improvement could take a very long time to measure, say if we're doing some kind of prevention initiative and we're, you know, communicating something to patients that we hope is going to prevent them coming back to the hospital, it could take a long time before we see a sort of return on that. Again, the kind of things that I've worked on, such as patient falls, sometimes the frequency in a particular area is quite low. So we need to infer that we've made an improvement by measuring the actual best practice processes that we're implementing. So that's what we call process measures. Are we doing all of the things that we hope will improve this outcome, such as, you know, measuring risks properly, making appropriate referrals, you know, delivering things effectively. Balancing measures are around looking at whether there might be any unintended consequences from the improvement that we tried to implement. So, you know, as I just mentioned, all clinical areas of hospitals, particularly at the moment, have all sorts of competing priorities. So if we invest a lot of effort into one thing, could it have a knock-on effect on something else that we've taken resource away from? So these are things that we also need to think about looking at before we make any changes. So this is just a bit of a sort of clarification about how measurement is used within QI. So measurement for judgment and measurement for research are sort of two different things that sometimes get confused with the type of measurement that we do in quality improvement. So when we say measurement for judgment, we're talking about all of the things that we do to measure sort of key performance indicators, all those management metrics. In QI, yeah, sometimes we get people coming to us and they say, well, this is the metric that our commissioners or our, you know, leadership are concerned with. How can we improve it? But if that's not something that's directly related to patient benefit, or that we can't really hope to see an improvement in, we wouldn't focus on that in quality improvement, because that's just what's being used to judge how well you're running as a team. The thing I think particularly for medics that can sometimes be confusing is that the way that we use measurement in research, in scientific contexts, is completely different, because in that environment, your main concern is proving things. So you need to have enough data for your your conclusions to be statistically valid, and you need to be controlling for all of the potential confounding variables that might be affecting the thing that you're observing. You don't do any of that in quality improvement, because in quality improvement the emphasis is on making an improvement in a sort of a pragmatic approach by using the least resource necessary to make that improvement. So we don't necessarily know in a really provable way that the factor that we changed definitely was the cause of the changes, and we do use some statistical techniques that I won't get into in this sort of intro session, but it's not about sort of proving things to a statistically valid level. It's really about just having enough information to make an informed decision about what you're going to change. So an example of the sorts of things that you might measure in a project here, if you were trying to reduce errors in surgery, then that would be your overall outcome that you'd be concerned with. But in order to achieve that outcome, there might be a range of smaller things that you would measure. So your process measures around delivering team briefs correctly and implementing a sort of bundle of actions. So this is just a sort of example of how process measures relate to outcomes. So you might need to change a bunch of different processes in order to influence the outcomes for patients. So I've got an example of a project that I was involved in that we that sort of got to the measurement stage. So as I mentioned at the start, in quality improvement, we try to measure everything over time at regular intervals, and this is what's called a run chart. It's just a line graph really, and if you've got enough data, you can add these control limits where you're seeing if the data is getting outside of what would be expected. And this one was for the early supported discharge service. So what I was going to suggest at this point is you can see the guy who delivered this project himself explain a little bit about it. If now, can people click on that link straight from the presentation?
Nope.
Yeah? No, not working. Let's copy paste it into the chat. Oh.
Yeah, I can click on it live.
So are you guys all right?
Maybe
Just
I'm using my phone.
Oh, okay.
My one worked.
So it's only a couple of minutes. So if I just give it a minute for those who can open it to I'll just see if I can copy paste it into the chat as well, because I think it's an interesting example. Yeah, so if you just watch a couple of minutes of that up to the 6.5 minute mark, and then I'll come back and explain a bit. Okay, I think I'll carry on because you should have probably had long enough to have watched that by now. That project, what Guy was trying to achieve was to increase the number of referrals into the early supported discharge service, so supporting people outside of the acute setting who are recovering from strokes. Just to explain how he was sort of taking it, so the measurement in that case was a process measure, the number of referrals, but we know that it's something that's very much worth doing because it's reducing the length of stay for people in hospital, and these kind of pieces of work are really relevant at the moment because of course we're really concerned about getting people out of the acute hospitals as quickly as possible into another setting. And so what you would have seen in the video is that he's tested out a few different interventions over time and then recorded it on this kind of run chart to see, are we seeing an improvement? Shall we, continue with that intervention or try something different? And gradually he started to see better results. So that's the sort of the first two steps of really making clear what your goal is in terms of improvement and having an understanding of how you want to go about measuring it. But as I said at the start, key difference in quality improvement is that you haven't got a solution in mind at the start. So quite often people will come to our team and say, we want to implement this new technology, or we want to make this change to how our team works, and we wanted to come to you as a QI team to help us do that. We have to say, well, that's not really a QI project. If, for example, you want to use a new software program or use some kind of new diagnostic equipment, it's not really QI because you've already decided what the solution is, and QI is for testing different solutions to a problem. So if you had if your main issue was around technology, you could test out different problems using different solutions using QI before deciding which one to go with, and you could use quality improvement to test the implementation of that technology. But if you've already decided what you want to do, then it's really just project management. So so the next step before we move into testing is having a sort of a list or a range of different things that we think might help us to improve the problem that we're addressing. So one of the ways that you can do that is through what's called process mapping, which I mentioned earlier, which is, we look at the whole process and all of the steps that happen along the way and identify where there might be issues or opportunities in that process. So this process map was for patients coming in to A&E, and this was for reducing patient falls. So it's not everything that happens in A&E, but things that sort of felt to be pertinent to addressing the risk of falls and where information might be getting lost, where risks might be happening. In process mapping, we've looked here at different places where the patients are going, moving from the clinical decision unit to a cubicle, things that are being done to them, reviews from the doctor, different assessments. And while we're having that conversation, so this map would have been created alongside staff from that area, they can identify things that might be going wrong, where information might be missing, where things are inefficient and so on. And those would be recorded on this process map in the form of the sort of the pink squares alongside it. And then the green ones are opportunities, like things that we could be doing better. This is another process map, which was for some work with the tissue viability nursing team. In this case, the process was quite linear, but there were lots of problems. So the different ways that you can kind of present a process map. But again, we're just generating ideas about different things that might be the root of the issue. In this case, the problem is patients not recovering well enough from wounds. but there's all sorts of factors that might be a factor underlying that around whether people are fully trained to assess those wounds. There was inefficiencies around the way people were travelling to their appointments and staffing levels and all sorts of different factors. So once you've got your kind of big list, not organised in any particular way, that you can generate through these sort of mapping activities, then you can put that into what we would call a driver diagram. So this is a driver diagram that was developed from the sort of idea generation around tissue viability nursing. And the driver diagram organises your potential improvement ideas into different categories. So you can see all of the categories here are feeding into the overall outcome that we want to improve about improving the treatment of leg ulcers in this case. So we've kind of organised our ideas before we start testing them, and there are a number of other things that you can do around kind of prioritisation of those ideas and considering which ones might be most effective. But the key question is just understanding what the causal factors are in your problem that you're trying to improve. Well, this was just a chart of how eventually it was improved, and I just realised there isn't very much detail on this, but the key interventions for that project were around staff engagement, really, and understanding of the issue. But once we've got our list of potential interventions or potential improvements, that's when we move into what we call PDSA, so Plan, Do, Study, Act. So the idea of PDSA is that we're testing improvements on the smallest possible scale, possibly with just a few patients or in one clinic, or just for a week or so that we've got enough data to make a decision about whether something that we've changed was helpful or not. But we're not going to test it on a huge scale because we want to be able to test lots of different changes and keep the ones that work and do away with those that don't. So the idea is after that brief implementation on a small scale, we look at the results, and if it seems that it was helpful and we can see an improvement, we would keep that change, and if not, we'd move on to the next thing, or we might potentially adjust it and try to deliver it slightly differently. This is an example of the PDSA plan that we're sort of currently using on ANU to improve patient falls. So if you can see at the top with the sort of coloured bars, those are that has come from our driver diagram, the different categories of problems that we'd identified, and then we're taking that and thinking which ones can we implement and start testing out over a period of, well, I would talk to them every couple of weeks and see how well each change had bedded in. And as you can see that we've started measuring after a few weeks, and actually there's a lot more data for that project now, and some of the things still did start having a really positive effect. But a lot of things didn't work as well, and that's the beauty of the PDSA process, that you're not going to go away and invest a huge amount of effort in something which then actually doesn't work in practice. So we made a small change to how they were organising their meetings to try and keep the bays observed more of the time, but it didn't go very well and the staff didn't like it. And that's not a disaster because we only tested it on a small scale, and so we know it didn't work, and we haven't just tried to immediately roll it out across the organisation. Another example, this was actually something that I worked on in another organisation before I worked for ESHT. But I used to work in public health, and we were delivering NHS health checks. So we had a large cohort of patients who we wanted to deliver these checks to, and weren't seeing enough of them because the health check took quite a long time to deliver. And so the reason I think this is quite a helpful example is because quite a lot of QI projects focus on improving capacity and patient flow. So this is a sort of good example of that. So in this instance, it was possible to see that there was a bottleneck in patients moving through this particular clinic because there was a blood test delivered via a sort of a point of care testing machine that took quite a long time to deliver, and then a dry blood spot test which had to be delivered by a nurse. So those were two sorts of bottlenecks that were holding up people moving through this process. So in order to improve capacity, the first thing we did was make sure that the nurse was not doing any paperwork or anything that would be distracting them from delivering the blood spot test, and actually increase that capacity so there was less of a bottleneck in terms of those tests. And then to start delivering the blood test right at the start of the clinic, so no paperwork or questions or measurements until that machine is running. And so that's running alongside the rest of the appointment. And then there was a third intervention, which was a sort of pull system to go and get patients for, so these processes didn't actually have to be delivered in any particular order. So we started pulling patients to see any person along the pathway at an earlier stage if there were patients waiting. So I guess what this is sort of trying to illustrate is that, you know, there's a series of different things that were tried out to gradually increase that capacity. And so that is the basic principle of PDSA, the sort of core thing that underlines quality improvement, that we are testing out lots of different small changes over time, and usually each one of them might not deliver a big improvement, but we're gradually making that big improvement by the implementation of lots of different smaller improvements. And that's why I sort of mentioned previously that QI doesn't necessarily work for everything. If you've just got to make a big decision between going this way or that way, and you can't test them ahead of time, then QI is probably not the right approach. But if you've got a problem and there's lots of different things that might be factors, then it can be quite helpful. And there's a lot of additional benefits in the sense that the approach of testing out lots of small changes over time can actually help people to feel more engaged with the problem. They can see the improvements happening, they can see the data coming back. And as I mentioned previously, you avoid the risk that you're going to try to implement something on a wide scale that actually isn't going to be well received by staff, or there's unintended consequences. So you're getting lots of data as you go along. So one of the things that we like to try and emphasize is that PDSA is not really a complex concept, and there's sort of a little analogy here that it's something that you would probably do intuitively in a lot of contexts anyway, but it's just a question of using that kind of thinking at work. So if, for example, you started baking bread, which many of us have this year, there's a number of steps to your process. You're going to mix the ingredients, combine the ingredients, mix them together somehow, and bake them. So there are various different variables that you can adjust to improve the quality of your bread. And say, for example, initially it doesn't taste that great. Your bread quality is quite poor. You're going to go back and look at what you did and try to adjust one of those things. In this example, maybe you try and change the amount of salt that you're adding to the bread mixture. But then in your next iteration, there's another problem. It hasn't risen properly. You'd go back and you'd look for other things to adjust, whether it's the temperature of the oven or the way that you're kneading it. So I'm sorry, I think I got cut off there. Can people hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah.
Sorry, I lost my Wi-Fi from. Yeah, just. Use a sort of PDSA approach to lots of things that they try and fix in everyday life, but QI is really just about taking that approach of testing different solutions and applying it in a work context. So that's pretty much it in terms of that talk. Just a few sorts of things to make you aware of. I mean, usually we deliver quite a lot of training via the QI team. Of course, at the moment, most of that's not available. But these are the training levels that we would normally deliver. QSA Fundamentals, which is a one-day training course, which hopefully we'll bring back at some point. And QSA Virtual, which we were going to deliver a cohort of in February, which of course is cancelled. But that will probably be back online at some point in the spring. And then Practitioner is aimed at people who are likely to be actually delivering, fairly substantial change projects themselves. And that really gives you a full understanding of all of the quality improvement methods that you would need to understand to sort of deliver a significant change project. So yeah, I mean, it's really difficult to summarize quality improvement in a short presentation like this. So if things aren't completely clear, I would just say, look out for when we bring back some of our training, because there's an awful lot more that you can learn. And there are quite a lot of resources online that you can access. As you saw, the link that I shared earlier, we've been trying to put some stuff on YouTube, and we're going to try to share some more that way. And there's a lot of content on the NHS Improvement website, such as some of the tools that I mentioned, driver diagrams and so on. There's guidance for all of that stuff on NHSI. And on the Trust extranet, there's a number of examples of projects that people have delivered as part of QI training here at ESHT. So I'd recommend checking out that page if you want to kind of find out more about things that have been happening. So yeah, we've got them in the form of these sort of A3 posters. There's a good sort of 20 or 30 of them online if you want to read up more. And yeah, this is the current QI team, which is very depleted because I've had quite a number of departures. So there used to be 5 or 6 of us, but it's just me, Emma, and Shannon at the moment. So we are a little bit stretched, and at the moment we're all redeployed anyway. Well, actually, no, Shannon is still working on QI. And, I think our big focus as a team at the moment is on patient flow. It's around, reducing length of stay and getting patients discharged and stuff like that. So if anybody's interested in those kind of areas of work, do get in touch. And as I mentioned, I'm working on falls. Emma works in frailty. So that's stuff that we're really interested in too. And yeah, I'm not sure if anybody's got any questions, if there's anything else you wanted to ask about. Nope. Well, that's it in terms of the slides. I guess just to say thank you all for listening, and I hope it's helpful.
Thank you, Adam.
Thank you.
Thanks,
All right.
everyone. FY2s, please fill in the feedback form if you could, please. I'd appreciate that very much. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Yeah.